Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Gillespie, a senior policy analyst on the early and elementary education policy team here at New America in Washington, D.C. New America pioneers a new kind of think and action tank where we incubate ideas, policies, and solutions toward our vision of a more equitable America that lives up to its values. Our early and elementary education policy team works to help ensure that all children have access to a system of high-quality early learning opportunities from birth through third grade that prepare them to succeed in school and in life. New America has been working with the U.S. Department of Education on the Kindergarten as a Sturdy Bridge initiative. And from that, we've learned from teachers, parents, school leaders, and administrators that there's an urgent need for better supports for students who are dually identified. That is, students who are multilingual learners with disabilities. So our webinar today takes the next step in examining how we can better serve these students and their families through exploring research, practice, and policy. So we're so happy for you all to be here with us today. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Kangas, who will give opening remarks and set the stage for this important conversation. Dr. Kangas is an associate professor and program director for the special education program at Lehigh University. As an applied linguist, Dr. Kangas researches the educational experiences of multilingual learners with disabilities. And she's particularly interested in understanding how schools can create learning environments that support both the linguistic and academic needs of these learners. Her research also examines how educational equity for multilingual learners with disabilities intersects with language policies and institutional structures. So please welcome Dr. Sarah Kangas.
Thank you, Carrie, and hello to you all. I'm going to share my screen here. And in my time here, just providing opening commentary about our session, I'm really just going to share with you what I think is the most important to know about this population, especially changes that we've seen in the past few years, as well as kind of answering the primary question of the webinar today is how we can better support these students. And our moderator and our panelists will dive more into these important insights in the upcoming minutes. So the first insight I think that's important for us to know is that this is a population on the rise, that multilingual learners or MLs with disabilities are about 16% of all of our multilingual learners in our K through 12 schools. And a recent secondary data analysis study found that in a 14-year time span, this population has increased by over 50% in the United States, with some states in particular having even higher growth rates. So if we look more closely at these demographic shifts, that same study found that in the Midwest, there was a 250% increase in that 14-year time span of this population, and that the Northeast of the United States had a 150% increase in our schools of our dually identified students. The West and Southwest, however, continue to have the highest levels of these students in their states. So that we see here on the map, some of our states in particular, MLs with disabilities are 25% of all of our ML student population. So we see that in the states circled there on the map. And these are 2020 data. So this is a rising population. I think what's also important for us to know is that this is a population that is incredibly diverse with heterogeneous backgrounds and needs. So commonly, you may think of an ML with a disability as a Spanish speaker with maybe a learning disability or a speech language impairment. But this population has a diverse range of abilities, language backgrounds, experiences with schooling and immigration. And so there's really not one student that typifies who an ML with a disability is. Unfortunately, we have these rises, but at the same time, our research is not really keeping up with the demographic changes that we see in early childhood and in our K through 12 schools. And in particular, MLs that have lower incidence disabilities. So children maybe who have complex support needs or visual impairments. These children in research tend to be completely overlooked, if not majorly overlooked. And moreover, we see that there are quite a few topics that haven't really been researched to greater depth in the education of these students. Research has primarily talked about the very important topic of special education referral and issues of over or underrepresenting these students in special ed. But there are other critical equity issues like access to bilingual education, high quality language programming and high quality individualized education programs, for example, that still have been unexamined, relatively speaking, in research. And so before we dive into hearing from our panelists and our moderator, I wanted to share with you what we do kind of see as we look at the research that has been conducted on this population, and what I would argue kind of 4 overarching needs that we have to better support these students in both our practices in schools and our policies. One, there is the need to address the child as a whole instead of just a fragment of their needs. We see there are tensions in the way we provide services and supports to the students where just a slice of the student's needs or a fragment of the student's needs are addressed. So maybe just their language learning or just their disability, but that the accounting of the whole child is kind of lost in the process. If you've ever had significant health issues and you've gone to different specialists, you've maybe had the experience where the specialist will treat a certain set of needs but not really attend to the other needs. That's not what a specialist does. And I think it's kind of a helpful analogy for us to think about in the education of the students, that we can kind of fall into that same dynamic where the well-being, the academic development, the language development of the child is lost in this process of attending to just certain needs here and there. The second important takeaway, I think, is related to this particular point of addressing the child's whole needs, which is also fostering shared responsibility. Education stakeholders in multilingual learner education and special education do not have a long history of working together. Again, addressing language or just addressing disability. And what we need is a shared responsibility where we work together and collaboratively to best support these students, bringing our expertise together, and then we'll be able to support the child as a whole. As I'm certain we'll hear from our panelists today, we do need more of an emphasis on the strength practices, their race and ethnicity and their socioeconomic status kind of pervade in our schools and often are the dominant lens through which these students are seen. So there is a need to focus on what these children can achieve and who they are and what capabilities they possess, particularly their abilities to be multilingual, their abilities to succeed academically in our schools. And then finally, and I'm very certain we'll hear about this more from our parent panelists, is the need to honor parents, families and communities in our practices and our policies with these students. We see that parent engagement continues to be a struggle for this population of students, with parents' voices and perspectives often pushed to the side, even though they have important hopes, dreams, insights for their students that are so valuable, and they are partners in their children's education. So these are just the 4 primary needs that I see as we look at practice and policy for these students. And I look forward to hearing more about these and other important needs from our panelists and moderators. And so with that, I turn it back to you, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kangas, and what a great way to set the stage for our panel discussions. We have an all-star lineup for you of panelists and moderator. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Maria Choi-Pena. She's assistant professor in the Educational Linguistics Division at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. And Dr. Choi-Pena is a bilingual and biliterate education researcher and educator who examines the intersections of disability, language, school-parent partnerships, and education policy. We're so grateful that she's moderating our panels today. For our panelists of researchers, we have Dr. Lillian Duran. She is professor of special education at the University of Oregon. Her research is focused on improving instructional and assessment practices with multilingual children. Dr. Claudia Rinaldi is the Joan Wheeler Arno Professor and Chair of Education at LaSalle University. She focuses her work and research on the implementation of comprehensive school reform efforts using evidence-based models like RTI, positive behavioral intervention and supports, and multi-tier systems of support. Next, Elizabeth Burr is a senior research associate in the Research and Practice Partnerships at WestEd. She works at the intersection of research and policy to support evidence-based decision-making. We are so grateful to have this panel here today. And for the audience, if you have questions for the panels, please feel free to put them in the Slido chat. So with that, I will turn things over to you, Dr. Choi Pena. Welcome.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Carrie. Thank you, Sarah, for that great setup. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Claudia, and Lillian for being here with us, with me today. This is a dream for me, having read all of your works and having really built a career both as a classroom teacher and as a researcher that extends, right, the work that you've tried to do, and I hope contributes to the visibility of these students in the world. So for me, I just wanted to start there, that I'm just so grateful to be here and to be listening to this work and to be part of this conversation. One of the things that we don't really, that hasn't been named, is the fact that we have no real grasp on how large this population is, right, within the United States. And part of it is because we continue to contend with these disparate systems, right? And these students can kind of continue to fall under either special education services or multilingual learner services. And so I'm really, really grateful to be in a space where we're talking about these students' needs holistically, right? And recognizing that for these children, their lived experiences are not either ors. They're not based on the singularity of a policy, right? But on trying to be members of their communities and trying to expand who they are, right, and contribute to the world. So with that said, I want to start off with some questions, and I'll start by leading it or directing it at one of you, but please feel free to kind of piggyback and add your thoughts as well. So Claudia, I'm wondering if you could kind of get us started in thinking about what does research say about assessments and about the identification of multilingual learners with disabilities? Oh, you're still muted. Claudia, can you hear me? You're still muted. Oh no. Maybe we can give
I can go ahead if you want, and while Claudia.
Lillian, yeah, would that be great? Great,
Yeah,
thanks
of
so much.
course. Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. And I just want to start out by saying, this topic is near and dear to my heart. I was an early childhood special education teacher for 10 years, worked a lot with multilingual students, actually in the rural Midwest. So many of these communities have become relocation communities. And I worked with not only Spanish speakers, but children who spoke Oromo and Anuak and Noor, and a rich diversity of languages in the Midwest or in Minnesota. So with that in mind, and my experience and background in thinking about assessments, I think number one is we have to keep in mind that language is natural. Language happens within communicative contexts. Language happens within relationship, right? And so when we go into assess, we're not looking at isolated skills. We're looking at that child's communication patterns. And I think when we really want to look at accurate assessment, we need to find more ways to conduct more naturalistic language sampling. We need practitioners that are more skilled at evaluating natural language samples and understanding how that really should be a complement and have parity with standard scores. We know that standardized assessments really fall short with our multilingual learners. They're not usually included in the norming samples. Conceptual scoring is only available in Spanish and English and on very few instruments. And so we're really limited with these tools that we're using. And yet there's such high stakes decisions we're making off of very flawed processes and tools that we're implementing. So that would be my main comment to start us off, is really reminding ourselves that language is natural again and happens within context. And in order to really look at that child, we need to look at their communication and not think of language as an isolated skill.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Claudia, do you want to try again?
Yes, I think I got it.
Yes.
Thank you, Lillian, for that answer, and Maria for getting us going. I agree so much with what Lillian said. And, the challenges to add to what Lillian said is we continue to assess the students in the same way that we're assessing the majority students. And so the challenge is we're not looking beyond different ways of assessment and using a test or just more formal processes when we should be really looking at informal assessments, observations, interview with the parents, which are very basic aspects of the special education process that we've kind of forgotten or moved away from for taking over the formal evaluation process. And, these aspects of observation, informal assessments, and family interviews are formal processes that we need to bring back to the table that gives us the richness of what we can get out of the child. One of the recommendations that I always give is to be looking at, the different classroom and home contexts because, the child responds differently if we do observational assessment in a classroom of 20, 25, 30 students versus a classroom, with the ESL teacher, a bilingual teacher where they have 4 or 5 students. So it's really critical for us to look beyond just the 1 or 2 hour test that we're giving them, but looking beyond to see what the child is actually able to do in the classroom with the active engagement that can be provided, so that we're really knowing, what kind of skills they actually have rather than just a question answer interaction that happens in most standardized processes. So I think we need to go back to that drawing table and look and create an assessment plan that includes beyond test, also the observation, interview with the child, interview with the parents, and also informal assessments of language and academics so that we could see where the child is growing as a whole child that you mentioned, Maria. And, the child does bring a variety of aspects to their life and not just what is seen in 1 or 2 tests that are given in a more typical or traditional process of special education evaluation.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, would you like to add? Very good. Oh, you're muted still.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I just wanted to first echo what others have said. It's such a privilege to be here, meeting my colleagues and also to have such a large audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to talk about the issue of disproportionality and in special education identification for multilingual learners. And typically we hear about over identification in that, which can vary by language proficiency and across states and even across districts, school districts. But I wanted to talk in particular about the issue of under identification in the early grades, which is sometimes overlooked, but that means that a group of multilingual learners is fewer multilingual learners in the early grades are identified for and provided with special education services. And that there are a couple of reasons for that. One among them is that there's a perception among teachers that there's still a misconception among some teachers that they must wait before referring a student for a full-scale special education evaluation because that student is still developing English. And other reasons are that some schools and districts even systematically delay or even block special education referral because they want to curb the perceived overrepresentation of multilingual learners in special education. And there's also another reason that lower access to healthcare for multilingual learners can mean that students are referred later. It's research shows that pediatricians often refer students or refer families for a referral 1 to 2 years earlier than teachers do. So I want to call this out because it's a real equity issue when students may not be receiving a timely and appropriate special education evaluation, just as much as it's a serious education issue when more multilingual students are referred to special education for services that they do not require.
Thank you so much. That thank all three of you, because it really highlights, right, how issues in the tools, right, in the assessment tools can then contribute to issues within the actual application of special and distribution of special education services, right? I think both Lillian and Claudia really highlighted for us the need for engaging in organic, real, community-based understanding of like assessments that take into account the context, right? That a child is learning in and is coming from, but also the number of times that they engage in a space, right? Rather than this set period or set window of time, right? And I think that that really highlights what Elizabeth is sharing around how it's important that we're really paying attention to children's needs and not just our perceptions or our ideas of when children should be referred or when children should be sent for service evaluation, because that also becomes another deficit that we contribute to, right? We know that early intervention services are the most supportive of students, so getting access to those is really important. So I guess that leads me to my next question. This is for both Claudia and Elizabeth. What do we know then around the role of family engagement in this pre-referral process? So Elizabeth, you already hinted a little bit to some of the equity issues that family could encounter and how those might hinder the pre-referral process. But could you add, what else do we know about family engagement in this space?
Sure. I just want to first check about sound. Can you hear me okay? I got a message that I was a little quiet.
Yes, this is a little bit better.
Oh, okay. And
Thank
I'm gonna also try to speak up. Well, first, I think it's just it's really important to say that parents know their children best, and so they are just a critical piece in the pre-referral process. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the next panel talk about this more in depth. They will know much more than I, but it's true that families know the habits, the preferences, the talents, and the language development and opportunities that their children have had. And knowing about how their students and children are, how they're behaving and acting at home and in other settings is really important to understand, and as well as family histories that go way beyond what a home language survey can tell. So I think it's also important to work with families and learn from them about fears about potential stigma or the labeling of their children, and to maximize access to other services that families may need. And also, it's so critical to help families navigate these non-parallel systems of English language development and special education, because that can sometimes result in a one-way transmission of information, whereas what we want is a dialogue and true partnership with families.
Great, thank you so much. Claudia, do you want to add to that?
Sure, thank you, Elizabeth. That was really right on. I would add here that we can't forget that the educational systems in every other country are very different. And so building that engagement has to begin before we get to this process, right? So getting to know the families early on in a variety of non-threatening ways, positive ways where we acknowledge the assets that they bring, through even just getting to know them, getting to know about literature in their countries or customs or the oral language that they might share with their children in terms of, you know, their customs and traditions that they bring, so that we begin on an open format communication with them when we do arise and have challenges. Another aspect I would add here is that job is not only the general educator's job to do, but it's also the ESL or bilingual teacher, the special education teacher, and all of them have to make that effort as we start engaging with this particular children. Just recently, I've been working with a district that has nonverbal children with autism in significant and separate classrooms, and the ESL teachers are pushing in, and which is great. So So that's a benefit, but none of them had actually spoken to the families in terms of the ESL educators. And that was kind of our first charge, was like, why don't you call them and kind of get to know them, kind of know the dreams for their children, what they typically do at home, what do they enjoy, how do they communicate with their nonverbal child, because they're the experts. And so, whether it's a mild disability, learning disability, or a more significant disability where the child's nonverbal and sub-separate placement, I think we need to go back to thinking about how we establish those relationships early on and in strong ways, seeing them as an asset and an expert of their children, even when we have them 6 hours, 7 hours of the day in our classrooms. So that would be what I add here in terms of family engagement.
Great, thank you. I feel like this is also one of the moments where policy really can inform us, right? And when we think about things like IDEA and how they center and position parents, really thinking about them again as members of a team, as equitable members of a team who bring expertise, who have voice, who have contributions to make. One of the spaces in which we as schools often try to negotiate those relationships, right? Because I do think that clear communication and connection with families is really important, but that can be difficult to achieve in a lot of schools that are filled with monolingual professionals, right? And so I think that really highlights for us the importance of bilingual staff. Can we talk here a little bit then around what do we mean, Claudia, for example, what do we mean when we talk about bilingual staff? Who are we talking about? How do we define bilingual staff in this context? Because I think this also becomes a little bit of a murky area for us that isn't as clear as how parents should be included, right? Because there is no clear policy structure around it. So can you share a little bit about that?
Sure, Marie. I think you're hitting that murkiness right on. And what I find is that when we're talking about bilingual staff, we're probably talking more about paraprofessionals who speak the children's language, unfortunately. And so we need to be doing better around diversifying the teacher pipeline, which a lot of people are working around the country on that, and the Office of English Language Acquisition is doing. But I think thinking about how we also talk with ESL educators and bilingual educators about how to highlight their knowledge about the language and their knowledge about English language development as well. I know many of them feel unprepared to do bilingual instruction, and so providing professional development that talks about how to provide that bilingual reading instruction or strategy instruction or special education, specialized instruction. It's really key. And just even beginning the conversations, I think we are at that beginning stages rather than even at more advanced stages.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I really appreciate you naming the role of paraprofessionals. I do think they're a really central interlocutor, right? For lack of a better word, that we don't pay attention to in the same ways. I know there is some up and coming research and scholarship being done on thinking of ways to create pipelines for paraprofessionals into the teaching profession, right? Particularly because they have this expertise in this linguistic background. I wonder what you can share with us, Elizabeth, along the lines of this conversation about bilingual staff, but particularly not just why they're important in instructional capacities, but in the pre-referral and in the evaluation process as well.
Sure. So building on what Claudia was saying, my colleagues at WestEd, Jamie Burrow and Alyssa Perez, and I recently did a study on the pre-referral processes for multilingual learners in state preschool in California. And there was consensus among all of our interviewees, educators and administrators in these preschool programs, that bilingual staff play a key role in developing trust between families and educators. And I think that translates to older children and students as well. They named that the bilingual educators could explain potentially confusing or daunting aspects of the pre-referral process, and they could facilitate communication with the family about the child's progress. during the pre-referral process. They serve as cultural ambassadors, and also they can assist with monolingual speech language pathologists and school psychologists, because there are even fewer bilingual specialists than even teachers. And so it was clear that the bilingual teachers were critical. We also learned that there was that even though bilingual teachers were key in terms of family engagement, and also being working with children on vocabulary in language 1 and language 2, we learned that just by virtue of being bilingual didn't necessarily mean that teachers were able to distinguish between typical multilingual development and a disability, which is a really complex process. And there are multiple factors outside of disability that influence the variability in multilingual development. So we learned from consulting with our peer debriefs with experts that specific training is really needed to understand the complexity and variability of typical and atypical multilanguage development. And so all teachers could benefit from this kind of training on oral language development. And that's also true because while Spanish is by and large the most common language, well, certainly in California and potentially in other states, but because of recent immigration and we have so much growth in the languages spoken in our schools, which is a tremendous asset. And it means that teachers may increasingly not speak the language or the dialects of the students in their classrooms. So having a Spanish bilingual teacher doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will have the benefits of their bilingualism. So just as Claudia was saying, professional learning is really important for all of our educators and specialists.
That's really helpful, because I think for many, language education is like special education, something that belongs to another subfield or a particular specialty of teacher, right? But what we're coming to recognize, right, which I think many have been saying for a really long time, but we come to these recognitions in waves, is that we kind of have to know a little bit of everything in order to be able to fully support and understand kids, right? So we may not know those languages, but we need to have some understanding of multilingual development. We may not understand how all disabilities manifest, but we need to have some understanding of what it means to be different, right? And an expansive view of learning.
Yes, and Maria, if I could just add something to that point, I think that's spot on. I really want to stay away from blaming teachers, because we're asking so much of teachers, and general education teachers often do not receive training in supporting the students with disabilities in their classes and the students who are developing, who speak multiple languages in their classroom, let alone the group who have both sets of needs.
And I would say that we see shifts, right, in the way that continuing development and professional development also happens for teachers, right? We see breakdowns in the ability for teachers to meet in grade level teams or in interdisciplinary teams. I've benefited greatly as a special education teacher from having conversations with my general education counterparts and vice versa, right? And we could talk about those things that even if I didn't learn in a context-based space, we were having in that space. So yeah, thank you. We definitely we want to recognize all of the labor that teachers take on, right? And particularly these contexts. Lillian, could you add a little bit more around why it's so important to have bilingual professionals involved in the delivery of special education and related services? It's not just about being intermediaries for parents and for children, right? But actively involved in these processes. Can you share?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I'll pick up kind of where the conversation left off. I think, language scaffolding strategies are high leverage practices, right? So understanding how to expand children's utterances, recast, have them modeling appropriate language, modeling expansive language, using novel vocabulary. All of these practices are beneficial for all children. And so going back to the idea of teachers in classrooms serving all children in inclusive settings, I do think it's important and a message to our preparers of future teachers, our higher education institutions out there, to really bolster their curriculum to include these high leverage practices that really benefit all students. And so with that in mind, tagging into now, why do we need bilingual staff? Well, number one, these children are developing more than one language, right? So in order to really effectively address their IEP goals, we need to have someone that they can understand. It's really that fundamental. And sometimes I say these things out loud and you're like, how much more basic could you get? Children benefit from instruction that they understand. And so when they're speaking to them in a language they don't understand, it could take them years before they're benefiting from the instruction. And the research really plays out, right? That we have our multilingual students fall behind in our school systems. We see this in our reading scores because what is reading? It's fundamentally language. And if we're not providing services in a comprehensible way, it really then impacts their ability to benefit from the services that we are providing. So that's like my primary reason why we need to have bilingual staff in the classrooms. Two, I also just want to bring up this idea of the mismatch in what we do in our services. We often now are on board with assessing in a child's home language. We will at least translate an assessment. We will find an interpreter because it's a legal mandate. And I'm out a lot nationally. I consult with a lot of programs. And there is like a baseline in the United States where folks are on board and understanding that. But then what have we done? We've identified a disability using that child's native language, home language, and then we provide services again in a completely different language. So how are we really addressing legally their IEP or IFSP goals and objectives, again, when we're providing in a language that we did not assess in and that we did not identify their disability in? So I think in some ways, these are policy and legal issues too, that seem so common sense and straightforward, and yet we don't describe them in that way. And I think it really is more an artifact of a system that's unwilling to change. And so we're continually trying to fit them into the system rather than having a system that really serves them.
That's really helpful. And I think being reminded, right, that these systems aren't necessarily created to serve students as they are right now is really helpful. And I think that also turns into a little bit of a call to arms for us as scholars and researchers, right? So what would you say remains a space of like, what research should we be looking at in the next 1 to 2 years around these ideas and topics, and particularly around increasing access, but also visibility, right, for these students and their needs?
I would really love to see more partnerships with programs who are providing bilingual special education. So, Forever Boulder, Colorado has had the Bueno Institute. They've really fought, really burgeoned and grew a bilingual special ed mindset, personnel, programs that were willing to embrace those ideas. I've worked in Minneapolis where they had bilingual Spanish, English, early childhood special ed classrooms. I feel like we need these partnerships where we support these innovative administrators and teachers, and we look at the outcomes. We compare the outcomes for those students versus English only settings. We all know that conducting research in special education settings is difficult. We have smaller sample sizes, we have a lot of heterogeneity, but it doesn't make it impossible. It just makes us need to stand up and rise up to that challenge to start documenting these differences of what happens when you're able to actually provide educational services in a language that the child understands, is able to benefit from, versus an English only approach. And I'd love to see many more of these kinds of large scale studies being funded, so that we could look not only at 1 year of progress, but longitudinally, because we know that's where we get our bang for the buck, right? Is when we really look at these kids' progress over time, when we're able to support their native language while we're teaching them English and really support full bilingualism and biliteracy in this population.
Thank you so much. It makes me think a little bit about Claudia's answer to the first question around what do we still need, right? And I think innovation in some of the tools, right? And some of the data that we collect and how we collect it is one of the things that we also need, which would really kind of meet that challenge that you're telling us to rise to, right? So it's not, we can't just be thinking about conducting special education research in the same ways as general education research, right? We also need to be thinking about novel ways to conduct this work. Elizabeth, what do you think? It's, you know, you really are spending a lot of time developing new ideas and research and looking at questions and kind of gaps in the field. Where should we go next?
Well, I was recently reading Claudia's report that she did along with some colleagues on state level guidance for multilingual learners with disabilities. And I was encouraged by what she and her colleagues found, because when I first started looking into this area of dually identified students, back in 1911 or 12, there were only 5 states with publicly available guidance manuals. And Claudia and her team, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 41% of the states now have internally developed guidance tailored to their local context, which I think is a great step in the right direction. And I won't get into the limitations that she found and in terms of the, you know, their accessibility or their length and so forth. But I'm interested in future research that looks at the take-up of these guidance manuals and the fidelity of implementation, and also changes in practice and student outcomes as a result. I think that's something that we just don't know, is the effectiveness of the guidance. And also I'm very interested in guidance for preschool educators, because as far as I know, there's none. And the MTSS frameworks and others and the guidance manuals really rely on reading and writing for assessments. And this is just obviously not appropriate for preschool age children. And what we found in our study is that preschool teachers are acting in good faith, doing the very best they can, turning to MTSS style frameworks and processes. But it would really benefit, I think, to have guidance on the language development for the little children. Children at 3 and 4, of course, have very unique needs, and as their language is exploding when they're learning, you know, more than one language. And lastly, and maybe this is a nice tee up for the next session, but I'm really interested in more research on family perspectives on the pre-referral process and how they feel how it's going, navigating both systems, and what supports they need, and assistance with advocacy, so that their children can thrive.
Great. Thank you so much. Claudia, since your report was mentioned, do you want to mention any thoughts?
Sure. Thank you for mentioning it, Elizabeth. I'm glad you saw it as positive, because I saw a lot of challenges with it as well, just because, like you said, there were a lot of limitations on it. But piggyback on that, one of the challenges that it made me think about as we wrote and looked at all the guidance being provided is that no state actually require or offers the ability for teachers to get bilingual special education certified or licensed. And that's a problem, because if we are not moving in that direction, now that we know the guidance is out there, that it varies so greatly, but then teachers are not given the reason or the tools to be able to get that certification and licensure, then I don't know that anything is going to change. I started a certificate program on bilingual special education a few years ago, and it's hard on enrollment. And I think it's because it's not tied to licensure, and teachers have to go back and be tied to licensure. So I think for future research, I think another area that we need to look at is, you know, what is the policy around licensure requirements and how that helps this particular population. So I think we need to be looking at how all these kind of the instruction, the policy, the research, the practice really come together to provide different supports to have different outcomes for this population.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you because you really touched on kind of this three-prong approach, right? So we need to be thinking about what good practices exist. How can we grow those? How can we expand them, right? We need to be thinking about what experiences are out there, right? And particularly what family experiences, what family needs exist. But we also need to be thinking about how we're preparing teachers and the avenues we're creating for teachers, right? If we're going to expand these classrooms, we need to fill them in some way, right? And so I really appreciate that this isn't a conversation that's just focused on one line, right, or one space of attention, but that as a broad audience, we can find our own place in how to respond and how to contribute to this, to the expansion of these programs with an equity lens and framework. We have a little bit of time. Thank you so much to take some questions from the audience. So one that I see kind of coming quickly, which or is drawing my attention, I think, given the context and particularly the changing landscape around migration in the United States and around school populations, is what resources, if any, do you recommend to help distinguish between interrupted education and special education with multilingual learners?
I think this is, an area where we do need to start working on MTSS models, multi-tiered systems of support models, and progress monitoring, right? So if a child comes here and they've experienced extreme poverty, trauma, forced migration, these issues are serious, right? Of course, impact their development, right? Of course, there are going to be significant needs for that child to support their social emotional development, to pick up where they left off if they were able to access school. And so I think we need more programs in our schools that recognize the child again as a whole, holistically, right? And really providing for them for social emotional supports, making sure they have access to food security, shelter, right? And then we can start looking at where are they academically, and having some assessments in place that are curriculum-based measures. We don't have to go straight to standardized assessments. There are measures out there that are more sensitive to change, that are tied to the curriculum. So curriculum-based measures such as FastBridge, DIBBLES, Easy CBM, iReady, like all of these are not exactly meant for them, but they at least allow us to benchmark where these students might be in terms of language literacy, numeracy development, and then those skills, we should target those skills where they fall and where we can see their strengths and where they have areas of need. Now, of course, this is all going to be challenging if they're emerging English speakers. And so we need to work closely with our teachers who work with English learners, right? I think this is another point that has not been brought up yet, is that we shouldn't silo our services. They have things to teach us as well. They've gone to school for how to support second language acquisition, how to tie second language acquisition to academics. So why don't we partner more with them, particularly in the interest of supporting these newcomer students who are a very heterogeneous population and have far more issues and far more needs than simply their academic growth, right? And I think we really need to think as a nation how we support them to really integrate and to realize their full potential once they're here.
I appreciate that because you're giving us, things that need to change, right? Spaces that we need to be working towards, but also tools that we can use in the interim. What already exists and how do we, use those judiciously to help us kind of mend the gaps. Elizabeth and Claudia, do you have any thoughts towards this question?
I'll go ahead and continue what Lillian was saying. I think the CBM option is a great one. And, that brings up what I was talking about at the beginning in terms of informal assessments. And, the challenge with, not using them is that then there is no progress monitoring happening. So the kids continue to get whatever they're getting potentially the whole year, and we don't know whether it's working for them or not. So this is the critical importance of what Lillian's bringing up is, first we need to find them, use them, use them the way that the MTSS model really calls for, which is about every 4 to 6 weeks, about 5 to 6 cycles during the year, depending on how your school year goes. But then also thinking about, how do we monitor language development as well? Because I think one of the challenges is the teachers feel like, well, they're not making any progress. I've tried it all. And it is frustrating and it is hard. And maybe gains are small depending on the trauma that the child brings, like Lillian talked about. But if there is growth, then that gives us information on whether it is a disability or is a language difference and is part of what the child is going through as a child migrating to this country and dealing with all the new aspects that they have to deal with. So I think, thinking about how do we progress monitor seriously or more consistently by where the model really tells us to do so, and also do it not only in academics, but also in language development, which can be done. Again, if we're observing the children, then we're able to see what they're able to use in terms of their native language and English, and really see what their skills are in both.
Thank you so much. I think this also brings to mind, the idea of kind of having classrooms set up or school spaces set up to respond to these needs, right, at the ready, rather than kind of retroactively, right? So it also calls for the different supports that we may need to be giving our community schools.
Yeah, that's what I was going. Oh,
yeah,
sorry, Maria.
Go ahead. No,
Oh,
no.
I was going to add. I was going to add that I agree with you, and I think there's been a proliferation of universal school-based social emotional learning curriculum across the country, and I think that there's an opportunity to and trauma-informed practices, and I think there's an opportunity to enhance SEL curriculum and trauma-informed practices to include the full diversity of multilingual students, and in doing so, to address their particular needs. But I think in doing so, it benefits the whole school community when schools are a welcoming place and increase a sense of belonging for all of their students.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up and kind of, given your research in early childhood, your most recent research on early childhood, how a lot of these young children are being served in home-based service spaces or kind of home childcare spaces. What do you think about, or kind of how do we think about these tools and these supports being, and this information kind of reaching those spaces and those communities?
This is a real opportunity because very little is known, and it was top of mind for me when we were doing our study. Our study focused on California state preschool programs because we had access to some data on that, and it was a beginning effort in one aspect of California's universal preschool program. But California does have this mixed delivery system, including the family child care homes and private preschools and other settings. And my answer is, at this time, I simply don't know. And that's an area that I would really like to pursue. I wonder if others on the panel know about research in family child care homes and what might be there. It's a gap for sure from my perspective.
I think the one thing that I would add is that I think this becomes another space similar to the paraprofessional space, right? Where we could really be developing a teacher pipeline from this space, right? There's a lot of children who are served in home-based daycare centers that are served by multilingual educators that they would not be otherwise in their own schools, right? And so this is also, I think, another space where we can be thinking creatively about how do we expand this profession, right? This burgeoning fields to meet the needs that we are identifying in our communities.
Right. I think that you're right. And I think there are networks for these providers, these practitioners. And so I think there's certainly a place to share information and provide professional learning in those spaces where the practitioners come together. But as with all teachers in all settings, it's a challenge to find the time. So I think capitalizing on those networks and the pipeline for sure are two levers.
I think it's also just understanding that there are different players in the field, right? And all of us are kind of contributing to trying to meet the needs of these children, both in their communities and in their schools. We're so close to time. So I want to ask this final question, which I think is a really good one to close on. We here have been having this really beautiful collaborative conversation where we've been able to build on each other because we have this shared ideology, right? And this shared fundamental belief of like holistic perspective of children. But we know that not all teachers and not all educators are trained in that same way. So how do we bring, general education teachers, special education teachers, speech and language pathologists and service providers, school psychologists, and other relevant members of the team to really align and understand this whole child holistic perspective that we've kind of been tapping into, right? That sees this child not just as a sum of their faults, right? But as this beautiful whole being that is also connected to communities and families and cultures. How do we bring them to the other side? The happy side.
Well, I would say so many teachers are already there. So to be fair, I'm going to say that I spend a lot of time with future teachers and in classrooms, and so I do appreciate that a lot of educators are there and they're trying their best to reach that whole child with limited resources and limited time also to be able to do that. But I think part of it goes back to our standards, right? We really teach to standards in our higher education programs. There's just no doubt about it. Every item and every syllabus is tied exactly to some standard in the state and why it's there. And our syllabi are filled with standards, right? So where is the room in our syllabi for all the other things? And I feel like this is where standards drive practice. And it's hard to get to disentangle them. So as much as we talk about academic freedom, if I don't meet all those standards in my class, those students will not be eligible for licensure, and I have to prove how I've met them. So I think we have to go back to our accrediting bodies and really talk to them about what in the end, what is the outcome we're really trying to achieve here through all these standards? It's a whole functioning, thriving being, right? That is able to contribute to their own development on their own trajectory of their life and to society's development. And so I think we do need to go back and have these conversations with those individuals who are often very separate from higher education, from teachers who are setting these standards, and really talk about, are these working for us anymore? Are they really meeting the goals that we want to achieve in education in the United States in 2024 with the populations of children that we're serving? And so that would be my comment there, and my thought there is really reinventing this idea of what the standards were meant to be, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and how tied all of our programs have become to them, for better or for worse.
Thank you. Claudia, do you want to add anything briefly?
Yeah, Lillian, I love that you said that because I think, we don't ever get the opportunity to sit with our general education faculty or special education faculty or ELL faculty or bilingual education or English as a second language and really think about what all these accrediting bodies are requiring, including the state's requirements, and how they work together or how they should be integrating together and where that should fall across the variety of courses that our students take. So thank you for bringing that up. Another thing that I would add goes more back to with what happens in schools and is, how do we ensure that general educators, special educators, and ESL bilingual educators are really sitting at the same time together, collaborating around inclusive practices and high leverage practices in a way that is not 3 times a year like some districts have, or maybe at one of the 10 professional developments, but that it is an ongoing, continuous meeting time that they have to really learn from each other, because each of them comes with an area that allows them to meet the child's needs. And I think the more they're able to get together and exchange those professional training and practices and expertise that they have, the more they're able to kind of learn from each other and address the whole child rather than being siloed into what they do for that particular 20 minutes they come in, or 10 minutes, or 30 minutes. So it's really honing in on how that there is time for collaboration, and that in that collaboration, they really see how each of them brings a piece of the puzzle to help that child, thrive in all possible ways as a whole child, rather than the pieces they can do, like you said, Maria.
Great, thank you. I kind of heard like 3 C's, right? So collaboration, communication, and co-construction of goals, right? So really understanding what is the mission, who is contributing to that mission, and how is it playing out in this space. Thank you so much. And with that, I thank all 3 of you for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you.
And I turn it over to Carrie now, who will turn us over to the next panel.
Thank you so much to each of you for such a rich conversation. It gives us a lot to consider. And thank you to the audience for great questions. Please keep them coming. Next, we'll move from the research perspective to the family perspective. We're grateful to welcome 2 parents of dually identified students for our next panel. And these 2 parents also work in this space. So first, we have Eliana Pardio. She is a Program Associate 2 in Special Education, Policy and Practice at WestEd. And she's based out of a home office in Florida, which is experiencing extreme weather at the moment. So we're really glad you're safe and dry and able to join us today. And we also have Paola Jordan. And she is the Program Director of the Metropolitan Parent Center at Sinergia Incorporated in New York City. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And I'll turn things back over to you, Dr. Choi Pena, to kick off this conversation about family perspectives.
Great, thank you so much. Today is such like a dreamy day for me, this amazing afternoon, because I get to be reconnected with Eliana and Paola, both of whom I've met in kind of this activist research space. So Liana and I know each other from NCIS. I always want to say NCSI because I want to be cool and modern. But we got to really connect on ideas around parent activism and space, and really elevating and centering parent voice and agency. And Paola and I know each other from activist work in New York City, where we not only have to engage in conversations around ability and disability, but around class, around race, around language, and how those kind of come together to really make achieving equity really complicated and difficult. So I just want to say, like, I'm so honored and thrilled to be here with both of you, and to get to share your expertise and your wealth of knowledge in this space. So I guess the first thing, which is actually really fun for me because I've never gotten to ask you, is how did both of you kind of come into this work of kind of special education for multilingual learners? And I'll start with Paola, or Eliana already unmuted. So
I think that for me, more than anything else, it was not a choice. It was something that it was a necessity. It was out of pure necessity. I'm a parent, a first-time parent, twins, and both of them have disabilities. So I started my journey pretty early when my boy was 6 weeks old, and they just turned 16, and it hasn't stopped yet. Yeah, so I'm counting the days for them to graduate for high school, and let's see what's next. But living this life in a city like New York City, when you have an accent, my first experience with ELLs was that I was considered by some of my peers that I'm an ELL parent, which I was not. And I found that mind-blowing, literally mind-blowing, because I'm expressing this out loud, but I'm being dismissed, consistently dismissed. So I'm like, it makes me wonder. It really put a point in my mind, thinking that how often does this happen? Not only with me, but with other people around. Like, how often is this really happening? And what are we doing to make things better? What are we doing things better to listen and engage with families in a way that we are an equal part in the conversation? So that's how I came to this job. I decided to learn more about it, and I had the opportunity to apply to work for one of the federal funded parent centers in the city, which has been a blessing for me and for many, many families. And to know that this is one of the resources that I don't see that is usually mentioned in spaces when we're trying to talk about disability ELLs and how we can support the community. And this is a safe place for parents. And there's one in every single state in the nation. Why we're not talking more about them, I don't know, but one step at a time, right? So that's has been my journey until now.
Thank you so much, Paola, for sharing. And I really appreciate that you kind of started by framing that like ratio-linguistic moment, right? This, often when we see parents or when we hear about parent struggles, particularly multilingual or racialized parents, people always say, well, if they learned English, if they learned English, if they learned English. But I think what you're really highlighting is that even when you learn English, right, when you tick the boxes, there's still this process of exclusion that the parent encounter and that often is extended to the child. So thank you so much for sharing that, but also for turning that experience into something agentive, right, for you and for other people in your community. Eliana, how did you get into this work?
Yeah, well, as Paola was just saying, it was not by choice for sure. I'm an immigrant, came to the US 20 years ago when I learned that my child actually had Down syndrome. He was diagnosed in utero. So we decided with my ex-husband to come to the US because in our minds, this is the US and everything was going to be so easy, right? It wasn't like that. It was, like a new beginning and realizing that there was a lot missing, especially thinking about, raising our child bilingual and bicultural. I was very lucky to be raised bilingual. However, as Paola was saying, I came here and I do have the accent, of course, because English is not my first language. And you can really see, how people, even you having the ability to communicate in your second language, still you can face, discrimination because people look at you by the accent, and really fast you are being called the Latina mom, the ELL mom, the mom of the child with Down syndrome, right? And that was just the beginning of my career. I had another child, my second child, ILN, she's a girl, and she was also born with Down syndrome, and that was completely unexpected. And by that time, I started working for the early intervention program because I wanted to learn, I wanted to help my community. And I think to me that has been the most fascinating part of my story and the story of my family, like how important it is for families to actually be involved in the system and understand, that our voices are important and we all have something to offer. Because many of us, like Paola, we are, like in leadership positions because, we grew, in this way. But there are so many families, like without being inside the system, working in the system, they have the ability to advocate, to speak, to be sure that their children get everything that they need. So that was for me the beginning, and something unique also was, like using my personal experience with my children to remind people that not because, children are assigned a label, a disability, or being dual language learners, they all need the same. In the case of my children, both of them, they have Down syndrome, they have grown together, they have been raised the same, they are completely different. And their needs, and their abilities are completely different because they are two different people. So to me, that has been basically, like the whole goal of my career, to actually make people understand that the labels, no, they don't actually, tell us who the child is, but they should be put in there to actually help the child maximize their abilities and show, what they can be.
Thank you so much, Eliana. And I think your story really highlights the way in which, being a parent, but particularly a mother, right, to a child with a disability really shapes so much of the rest of your life. I know in my own research and scholarship, I have found that having a child with a disability doesn't just influence school-based decisions, right, or medical decisions for the child, but it influences migratory decisions for the family, employment decisions for the parents, communication and language decisions for the whole family. So I really appreciate the ways in which you're highlighting how having a child with a disability really touches on these different aspects of your life, and that focusing on education is a way to kind of respond to a lot of these at the same time. So having
Yeah,
said that,
I
I guess,
wanna say something really
yeah.
fast that you said. I wanna quote you actually. Once you said like parents are anthropologists of their own lives, and they build their own systems and all that. That to me was, so powerful, because I think that's the other part of the story, of all of us. People many times they see us and they feel like, oh, they are coming to get something from us. We are bringing so much and we are giving so much and we are growing, and we are discovering this new life and this new world, and we are sharing that, and everyone benefits from that.
Yes, and I think what that really highlights is this idea that thank you for remembering my words, but also for bringing them forth in this space where parents are viewed as charges, right? Either they cost money to the system, right? Or they, are stressful for schools and for all these things. But we're not often thinking about what it is that they are constructing, and the scarcity that they're encountering in the spaces that they're trying to build something fruitful for their child, right? Where they're just really trying to get their children what they deserve, right? Space, visibility, voice, access, right? Having said that, what are some of the biggest challenges that you two have faced as parents of dually identified children, or even as professionals working in this space who also have to live these lives?
I think that one of the biggest challenge, besides the language barrier, is not knowing my rights. Because this is the part that is so important to highlight, that parents, we have rights within the Department of Education or Department of Health, which is the one that supervises early intervention. And that is the part that for me has been a constant as a parent when I was in my beginning stages doing this work, advocating for my kids. And then now when I move to a professional level, and this is an ongoing work that needs to be done and reiterate for families. Every single family that is identified that needs to have access to certain programs and services. Something that I have seen is that after COVID, there is this implicit assumption that everything is accessible online. And I have to really think harder right here to say, if this is a statement that is going to be applicable for all parents, for all users, because the reality is that when you look into the work, in the detail of the work that we're doing, trying to reach the families, you're going to find other barriers, not even the language. Because once you teach the tool to the family, they get it very, very easily. But think about access in terms of, does the family has a computer or a laptop or even a system that is going to allow them to go and access that information? That's one. If they have the system, do they have an internet connection that is stable? Because in many cases, especially during the pandemic, or I was doing some work for early intervention, doing some outreach work, I realized that there was the implicit requirement, but you can do telehealth with your phone, without understanding that some of those phones have up to 200 minutes. And that's a life-saved line for families to connect and to do appointments and to do everything else. And what ended up happening is that I prefer not to get the service, but it's not because the infant and toddler doesn't need the service. It was because of something else. And right now, when there is so much push about telehealth services for early intervention or therapeutic services, we're looking at through the convenience of the provider. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying yes, but guess what? The service needs to be driven also based on family needs, especially around early intervention, where you talk about natural environments. Nothing has changed in the statute. Nothing has changed in regulations. So this should not be at the convenience for some at the expense from others. So just because those rights and information are online, we need to make sure that you know clearly how you're working. If you know the family well, you identify the barriers, and then you do the best possible for you to remove those barriers so the families can learn about that. I think that without the knowledge, we continue seeing situations where students' rights are being violated, where parents don't know how to hold the school districts accountable. They don't even know how to engage clearly with the school teacher or going to an IEP meeting when they know that it's their right to request translation and interpretation. It's not a favor. It's not just because I'm being kind. It's not because you're mom, you need that. And I think that is the part that for us at the Parent Center, it has been a foundation in the last couple of years for us to bring this awareness and this knowledge to wherever we go.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Paola, because I also think, we're currently in a moment in time where technology is viewed as the panacea for everything. We're seeing this happening also with AI, right? A lot of conversations when you have with people about translations and interpretation, well, we can use AI, without really understanding that what most of these families and parents need and want is a human connection, right? To know that someone else is as invested in their child as they are, someone understands their experiences, their struggles, their wants for their kids. I similarly did a study during the pandemic in 2020, and parents talked about receiving technology with no explanation on how to use that technology. Well, technology in and of itself wasn't translated, right? So it wasn't supportive. And we are in a time where we are blaming parents then for failing to know that. A few months ago in New York City, there was a snow day and kids were supposed to be online, right? The internet services were down and parents weren't able to connect. And the mayor of the city went on, television to blame parents for not knowing how to get on, right? This is not a space where we're thinking of collaboration, where we're talking about support, right? So in that moment, we just add further shame and stress to a challenge that parents are trying to scramble and encounter. So thank you for bringing that to light, Paula. Eliana, what about you? What challenges have you encountered in your work?
I think at the very beginning, when I was younger and my children were younger, my son is 20 and my daughter is 17 already. But I remember the very beginning, my biggest challenge was to be seen as a whole person. And Dr. Duran was just talking about, the importance to see the whole child, right? That is also something that really affects families, that when people approach you, they feel like, oh, poor her, she's not from here and she has 2 children with Down syndrome and she's divorced. What can I give you? What can I gift you? Do you want rice? Do you want beans? I mean, sadly, that is still the approach. So to me, it is important that people understand that we have to elevate our expectations and see everyone as humans beings with potential, right? Because I do love the people that challenge me and they tell me like, this is the book, go and learn IDA, right? Because I can do it. And I'm sure that we all can do so much as families because we love our children and we want to learn. And sometimes we are placed in this, position of victimization because it is too much for us. However, to me, it's also important to bring to the table that everyone who has a child with a disability is going through something. So we can create, cohesive communities in which we help each other and we, connect with each other and we actually, walk the walk together instead of actually segregating, these families from these families and from these families because we believe that this family is not good enough. So I should be giving them, a flyer, and this one deserves to get the whole book, right? We have to get to that point in which we have those high expectations and we can make information accessible. Paola was just talking about that. It is a process, right? I'm sure Paola is not the person that she was 16 years ago. I'm not the person that I was 20 years ago. And many times we have to play basically, the imposter syndrome because we want to look smart, and we want to gain the respect of people. And we don't realize that many times when people are pushing us to be someone else, that's when we are basically erasing our identity. When we feel like it is okay for my child to only speak English because we are in the US, it is not okay. We have to grow, as parents and families, proud of who we are. And for that, we need the support of the community as a support, not because they are going to keep, feeding us, but instead because this is going to help build our families. So again, we can give the best of us and we can keep helping the people behind because disability is natural, right? We know that. And being bilingual it's a good thing. There's nothing bad about that. So I always feel like that is so important. And that was a real challenge to me when my children were younger, because something else is that people used to tell me like, why do you complicate your life so much? Do you speak English? Yes, I do. So talk to them in English. And I was like, no, I don't want them to learn English first. I want them to learn Spanish, because that's their identity and that's my love language, right? So to me, that fight was like the big one when my children were younger.
This makes me think a lot of a quote or a conversation I once heard of Jen White Johnson, who is she's also a scholar activist and a mother, and she's a Black woman, and she's raising a son with autism, and she herself is neurodivergent, and she says that people assume that what makes my motherhood path difficult is my child, but it's really raising my child in this society. Right. And in this context. And I think that's kind of what you're touching on, Eliana, right? It's that people then view you and your child as not being capable, as having these limitations, rather than giving you an expansive space to build this work, to flourish, to be your whole selves, right? With the scaffolds and supports that you need. So I guess that makes me think, Paola, in thinking about, current context, right? And political context and spaces, how does the current environment affect the experiences of dually identified children and their families?
Mhm. That's heavy. It's a heavy question, especially for us living in a city as diverse as New York City. And when the perception around the outside the city of the state is like we are liberals, that we are embracing. And the reality is that here in New York City, the public school system is the most segregated in the nation. It's going to start with a full stop. The disparities between Black and Brown families and Caucasian families, or by wealth, is based on your zip code and is based on the schools that your child are going to. And it creates a lot of friction internally, consistently, all the time. Then you have the other frictions around shared schools and then the independent schools, because we're talking about over 1 million students in the city, more or less. When you're thinking about those numbers and the magnitude of what we have here, think about that we have over 160,000 ELL students at any given point in time last year, in the last school year. And when you're thinking about it, let's go and disaggregate this information about how many of those have IEPs, or how many of those students have response to intervention with their clearly don't have an IEP, but guess what? There's some issue right there. So right there comes with identification. And of course, everything is connected with budget. So when you have this landscape, when the system is controlled by the major and the decisions comes from higher up, and it takes time to go down to the ground level, it is tough. It is really tough, because I have seen, especially around language access policies that are clearly aimed to improve the communication between the school and the parents, that starts in the higher level up, but the delivery is lousy. It's lousy. When you say, for example, oh, I need someone to translate for me, you're not going to grab someone in the office that speaks somehow the language, because for you to do this job, you need to have certain training and expertise. The other part is that when you have a city, when we have over 100 languages and dialects that family speaks here, it's mind-blowing. And right now we have materials on our websites for the Department of Education and any other system with maximum 9 languages. You can find that information there. So this is one of the issues. The other one that we're having is that we are living through a crisis, a housing crisis. We had the migrant families. We had the right to shelter. But right now, that right to shelter has been threatened by policy where families are being moved around. And think about when you have a family of a school-age child, whether the child has a disability or not, whether the child is an ELL or not, it's affecting the family's stability and their engagement with the school. It's sabotaging that process when you're trying to build community with your school. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want to be part of the community. We want to be part of the school. We want to be respected by who we are and our cultural differences, so we can start the assimilation process if we want to. It cannot be an imposition. So those are the factors that I'm seeing right now in terms of policy. Is it is a lot going on. Students with disability, they're not doing great academically. When you look at the data, they're not reading, they're not doing math at the level that they're supposed to. And everybody's overwhelmed. When I say everybody, think about teachers, administrators, families, even students. And there's going to be a moment that we need to make a stop and see, all right, what's working, what's not working. So that is challenging. Something positive that happened very, very recently, early this week, is that the New York State Department of Education released their recommendations to shift the whole criteria for graduation. And they're opening up multiple pathways for this. I think this is positive because, you know, we have different type of diplomas and different type of avenues to graduate. And some of those don't really recognize the job that especially students with disability are doing. Not everybody's a good tester. It doesn't mean that you don't know or you are unable to demonstrate your proficiency in certain areas. So this is a work that is being initiated for a couple of years. We're not going to see it yet. Probably by the end of the year, we have better guidance. But this is something that is important to highlight in terms of policy and the challenges that we have right now.
I think something that comes to mind too, kind of in between the policy and the application, is the funding, right? I think given a political context at any point in time, we can see more funding being invested towards multilingual services, right? We can see more being invested towards social emotional learning, more towards special education services, as opposed to kind of how they play out. But I think having said that, Eliana, thinking about this context that we're in right now, what thoughts, what do you want policymakers to kind of know about supporting dually identified students, right? Like, step one, we need money that matches policies. But I think even before that, or somewhere along the lines at the same time, is we need policies that, what do you think?
Yeah, exactly. I think obviously we need money, but first we need to change our perceptions. We need to keep working, on changing the approach that, again, this is an spending, that we are spending money, and we have to understand that this is an investment. These are American citizens. We have to be sure that they get all that they need so they can be successful, because we all can be successful with our unique, abilities, and we have to be sure that we understand that. I think we need to keep, working on creating awareness in our communities so we understand what we are trying to do. Because I feel that many times, there's this good intention, but people unconsciously, they are full of biases. So they actually do something that is not going in the right direction because, again, the deep inside, they are still approaching this from the perception that this person needs to be, sustained, and this person doesn't have the ability to gain, independence and be successful. And we need to change that, because something that I know based on my experience and the experience working with so many families along, my whole career, is that we all have abilities, and the problem is never in the child. The problem is in the system. When the child is not doing, a good job, is because we are missing something. So we have to work on actually building that responsibility and that awareness to really understand, that even when we think about the social concept of disability, happens when there's no accessibility. And that really applies to everything, right? Because when our children don't have what they need, then they cannot learn. If they cannot learn, they cannot be, their best version. When that doesn't happen, then we are not doing a good job for our country. And we are all citizens, and we all want the best for our country. So to me, that very foundational part needs to still, be worked on, and people need to still, think about the importance of awareness and inclusion. Because, again, something that I see happening still, after so many years, is that we are still segregating in the attempt to include. We create a lot of differences. We have to believe in inclusion and understand, how important it is. And I was gonna ask something else, In the case of my son, he was also diagnosed with autism when he was 3. When he was 5, they told me that he was going to be nonverbal and he was never going to be independent. My child is fully bilingual and is graduating, is the first student with disabilities graduating with a regular diploma in our county. So that part is so important too, that we understand when we write policies, that thinking about evaluation. Yes, the evaluation can tell something today about your child because this is the version of this child, but it doesn't mean that it's gonna tell you who your child is gonna be, right? So thinking about that also, like, again, awareness, understanding, and humanizing our children to understand that everyone is an individual is so, so important to me.
Making me think of these 3 eyes, right? So kind of this intersectional perspective, right, of seeing children as the multiplicity, right, of their experiences, with an eye towards inclusion, right, of everyone belonging, having a space within their community, with an understanding of interdependence, right, and a value and appreciation for interdependence. I think that's a really central aspect of disability justice, right, is moving away from valuing independence as the sole criteria of success, right, and recognizing the value of interdependence. Thank you so much, Eliana and Paola, for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us. I have a couple of questions from the audience that I kind of want to think about or want to think about with you. The first question is from a teacher, and I'm actually going to change it a little bit because the question starts with, as a teacher, I'm often told by parents of English learners that they're afraid to speak their home language at home, and they're wondering if you hear that often, and I'm certain that you do. I guess what I want to shift that conversation to is, how do you interrupt that line of thinking? What do you say to families who say that to you? Because we know a lot of families fear this, and how do we disrupt that fear? How do we really tackle that underlying fear?
I think that the first thing that we need to think about, that this is not a myth, it's happening. And it happened frequently in many conversations that is probably between 2 people, but it's happening. And that puts a pressure for the families and for the professional, how you're going to address this. I think that there is an urge, a desire for some communities to do the assimilation process fast and quick for this new culture, and many times at the expense of sacrificing who they are or what they know, or their customs and their beliefs. I think interrupting this conversation comes with I will say, the first fact that you are seeing the family, you're seeing the parent, you're acknowledging that presence. That every family, when you do the registration card, that they give you a little bit of information. Find the space for them to share with you, to open up. And that's when you create a strong foundation that is going to last the whole year. You're going to earn this family trust. You're going to learn this family respect. Because, for example, in our Latino culture, we are raised with the respect to the elders and to the authority. We don't dispute that, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be agreeing with that. Am I going to say yes to everything, but behind the scenes, I'm going to say, I'm not going to do that because I'm in disagreement. So this is part of the cultural approach that is so important when your administrators are working with professional development. This needs to be part of that, cultural competencies. If you remember at the beginning of this webinar, that we were talking about that, to look the child as a whole. I took notes for that because it was, I hold it. To look the child as a whole, but I want to push more on that and say to include the family, because the child is nothing without the family. It's that we are a unit. We are together. And this is one of the aspects that migrants, we have to process, that we need to send our kid for X amount of hours to a different place when sometimes I'm not even welcome. I'm not even welcome to be in the classroom. I'm not even welcome to observe what's going on. And guess what? Because we never receive our education here, this is novel for us. So when you find a space to see this family, to acknowledge the presence, and to learn from them, I'm telling you, you're going to create a long-lasting relationship, and you're going to create that connection that many, many schools are trying to figure out how we do that. But that's the answer. It's just that we're doing it in different ways.
Mm. Ileana, do you want to add?
Yeah, sure. So I do feel that many times those insecurities from families, they come from the environment, right? You wanna be sure that your child speak English because you hear all the time, if your child doesn't speak English, nothing is gonna happen, or you have to speak English because you're in America. So we are bombarded, all the time with all this information. So I think we all have been through that process of finding our identity. I have always believed that it's not about assimilating, but actually, finding who we are as bilingual, bicultural, multilingual, multicultural people. And I do feel that when we are honest, when we have an honest interest in people, people feel proud of who they are. So to me, always the key is education. When we see, these situations, challenges in which people are struggling to connect to other people because of race, of language, it is important that we address the need of professional development, as Paola was just saying, culturally responsive strategies that are going to make everyone feel comfortable and proud of who they are. So we talk about our culture. So we speak about, who we are. So we save our native language, and we pass that to our children, thinking again, about the future of the country. We want a country in which people can speak, like in Europe, 4 or 5 languages. That's a big deal. There's nothing wrong about that. That's such a gift for your child. But if you are going through this process of feeling insecure and not knowing where to go, and everyone around is telling you like your language doesn't matter, stop, speaking in your native language, go with English, then eventually you're gonna do it. So that's why it's so important to get this professional development. And again, go back to the very beginning and understanding that awareness make a difference. And when we are all educated, about the gift and the amazing things that diversity brings to our community, I think everything is easier.
Thank you. I think both of your answers highlighted something that, I've also found in my work and that I talk about in my book of like a lot of this fear stems from a fear of rejection, right? And not just a rejection of the child, but a rejection of the parent and family themselves, right? A lot of these families have encountered linguistic oppression. They've encountered linguistic bias, including from people within their own ethno-racial communities, right? And so I think one of the things that we can do is tap into recognizing that the fear is legitimate, but it's a response to oppressive systems, right? And really helping other families and parents understand that this isn't right? Being treated in a certain way because you don't speak English is not appropriate. And furthermore, that their response to that rejection, right, often results in them removing themselves from their children's lives, right? So one of the biggest things that comes from my work is parents then raising these monolingual English speakers when they themselves aren't monolingual English speakers, and really that drives this wedge and this gap between them. So I think one of the things I often do to interrupt that fear is to remind parents of their role, of their importance in their child's education, and what will happen if their child goes to an English only space, right, is often their own erasure. But I really, you are both just such, giant vessels of knowledge. And so I really want to close with offering something to the audience. And one of the participants asked this wonderful question, which is, what recommendations do you have on where parents can learn more about their rights? And particularly dually identified parents can learn more about their rights.
I think that the first place, and there's a couple of ways, but the first place I will say, if the local educational districts are not intentionally doing this job, which I hope is not the case, who knows, is to, as teachers, whoever is in contact with the family one-to-one, to point to them to that direction. The other second direction is to point to them to their federal funded parent centers. You have a wealth of knowledge, and you have people like me who are also parents of kids with disabilities. And in my case, a bilingual parent working, doing this job. And most of the frontline staff were parents. So that's another safe space that they can do that. Something that I have found also from, the clients that I'm working with, there is this, believe it or not, there are Facebook groups. There are so many spaces that families, they're building within themselves together with no extra guidance or pressure. It's a natural way to connect. It's a natural way to relate to other families that are experiencing similar challenges. And the last one that I'm seeing very recently here in the city, especially among the Spanish-speaking parents, they have parent leaders in their community, in their schools. And when you make those connections possible, how do you do that? You need to go back in person. We need to offer in-person opportunities for families to come together and enjoy an afternoon. It doesn't have to be about fundraising. It does not have to be about talking whatever your child is not doing, because that's what we hear in IEPs. But it can be a festival. It can be something that your school is doing, and you are intentionally identifying the families and you creating a safe space for them to connect organically. You create the space and then you back up. That's another way to do that. But it has to be something intentional. I prefer if it's in person because, again, not everybody has the ability or the capabilities to do this online. And then you will see how those families, once they identify that they are not alone, that they're not the only ones, they start building community. Absolutely. I have seen families here creating their own personal WhatsApp groups, and it's pretty active. They're very active. And right there, they're going to talk about their experiences, what they're missing, their success, because it's important also to talk about the success story. I was able to successfully access and request X, Y, C, and D. Or this organization in the city is doing this particular work. So they are absolutely leaders within their own circle. So I think that's something that you guys can think about it. How can you get to this?
That's great. Thank you. I also think, this idea of parents connecting with each other is really important because, many hands make for light work, right? So I may know about one aspect of rights, or I may know about transition plans, but I know a different family that knows about language access or evaluation. So really coming together and, not being afraid to make community and to recognize that there are many of you out there who are also asking questions and trying to grow and learn together. Eliana, we have a couple of minutes. Do you want to close us out with where can parents go?
Yeah, I think first, also it's important to recognize that we can play a role in which we are active, right? We don't have to wait for things to happen. To me, that is crucial, Again, not everyone is the same, but if you have the ability to lead, go and look for the opportunities, make that happen. Because yes, we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. So it is important that we are proud of who we are, our language, our culture. There's nothing more horrible than walking into a school building and seeing someone Latino that that speaks Spanish or any other language, and that they don't want to speak their language because they want you to speak, English or stuff like that. So we have to become, the ambassadors of being multilingual, multicultural, and we have to fight to make families understand that everything that you learn, it can be of so much value for other families. To me, from this whole experience raising two children with Down syndrome and who are bilingual, the magic has been to actually being able to give because it feels so good. I mean, you feel like there's a reason behind. There's a mission. So when we give to our community, we are building new leaders. We are, growing as leaders in the community. And I do feel that that's the best part, take action and know that we can make a change and we don't have to wait for someone to give us the opportunity, but we can build that opportunity. And as Paola was saying, if you have the means to actually support families, or you're looking for ways to support families, give them opportunities to become leaders and to speak on their own and to use their voices and to learn that they can make a change and they can become their children's best advocates and keep, building new advocates in our communities. That's what we need the most, representation.
Great. Thank you so much. I feel like that closes almost in a similar way to where we opened, right? Of parents, one of the ways that parents can really grow their own knowledge and awareness about their rights is by believing in their knowledge and awareness about their rights, right? By believing in their expertise, and by also understanding that they have something that they can provide and share with others, right? That their experiences are filled with lessons, but also experiences of joy, right? And opportunities for connection and opportunities for them not to feel isolated and to also benefit from interdependence and community building. Thank you so much. It's always just such a delight to get to be in a space with either of you, but to get to be in a space with both of you is so wonderful. And I hope that the parents that are in the audience are able to feel affirmed by the stories that you've shared. But I also hope that the teachers, experts, and the other stakeholders can see the wealth that we have in parents and can continue to find ways to make space for it, right? I know that we're all trying, we're all working against machines and against systems, but I think the more that we recognize the work that we're trying to do together and collaboratively, the more we'll be able to move the needle. So thank you both so much. And with that, I turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you so much to Eliana and Paola for sharing your personal and professional experiences and perspectives. The audience members that we heard from said hearing your perspectives was so powerful. Another commenter said we need to meet families where they are and not try to make them fit in the box we created. So thank you so much. Thank you to our research panelists and to Dr. Choi Pena for your thoughtful moderating and for the work you all do to support and advocate for dually identified students. It's a real privilege to get to learn from you all and hear you all in dialogue. Now we are going to move to the federal policy perspective. We are very lucky to be able to welcome Glenna Wright Gallo, Assistant Secretary of the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services at the U.S. Department of Education. The Assistant Secretary will share perspectives from the federal policy level as we look to the future for what more we can do. So please welcome Assistant Secretary Gallo.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And this has been a great opportunity for me this afternoon to join you and hear from our various panels. I'm very grateful about the opportunity to join us and to deepen my understanding of current issues and necessary solutions, as well as to hear the lived experiences of families with multilingual learners with disabilities. I'm going to take a few moments to kind of set the stage with what actions and activities the Biden administration has taken, the resources that are available, some of which were referenced by our panel members today, but some that you may not be as familiar with, and then to talk about future actions that I'm hoping all of you who are on this webinar will take after we conclude. So starting with this, the Biden administration has taken several actions to address the challenges and support our multilingual community, including multilingual learners with disabilities. I'm going to, just for ease of reference, group these into three main groups. The first group that I'm going to talk about is ensuring representation and inclusion in policies, guidance, and technical assistance. Then I'm going to talk about grants to support innovative and effective instruction. And then I'm going to talk about ways that we're working to strengthen the workforce of special educators and educator and providers who are serving this population. So starting with the first group, ensuring representation and inclusion in policies, guidance, and TA. I think the first thing I'd really like to highlight is the president's executive orders on equity, which require us working at the federal level to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all through a systematic approach to embedding fairness in decision-making processes and to work to address inequities in policies and programs that serve as barriers to equal opportunity. To me, that's very telling. And when we work with the disability community, that's something that we are all fully behind, that support of where do we see barriers in educational opportunities and how do we remove and reduce those barriers. So starting with those presidential orders, we have several actions that we've taken here at the department. One is, I always think it's helpful to know the data behind the population that we're talking about and that we're seeking to make improvements on. Several panelists have talked about data as well as more recent research, but I want to make sure that you know there's an OSEP Fast Facts out regarding students with disabilities who are English learners served under IDEA Part B. Came out in 2022, and it shows that this population, and the language used in this brief is English learners with disabilities, that it's about 13.7% of all English learners nationally. These are school-age students who are identified as both being a multilingual learner as well as having a disability. We also know, based on that data review, that these English learners were more likely to be identified with a specific learning disability or a speech and language impairment, and less likely to be identified with other health impairments, autism, or emotional disturbance when compared to all other school-age students served under IDEA. This is really important to know because we know, in our panelists all talked about the disproportionate representation and some of the lack of guidance that's available in states, or the lack of consistent guidance that might be available around determination of eligibility. And so the data are showing that as well. We also know that the number of English language students with English learners, students with disabilities grew by close to 30% between school year 2012 and 2020. So it increased by 30%. We also saw disparate outcomes. We saw more students with disabilities who were English learners who dropped out of school, fewer who graduated high school, and more who were more likely to receive a certificate as compared to a diploma. All of those things, I think, are very good, and they support the words that we heard from our earliest panelists about the needs that we have in this community to identify additional policies and practices that support their success. Other things that we've done at the Department of Ed is we're really looking at how do we work together across the Department of Ed and across states and with local leaders to address the needs of this population and this student group. We are looking at how do we coordinate around English learner and Title III coordination, Title III guidance groups. We're doing cross presentations with groups that touch this population of students. We've also released with the OELA department, the English Learners with Disabilities fact sheet, and included information in their development of a newcomer's toolkit. At the end of 2021, we also released a policy letter that addresses inclusion of language development goals in an IEP, as well as best practices to appropriate instruction throughout the school day, and resources to consider for developing IEPs and providing instruction for English learners with disabilities. We also have a variety of Department of Ed funded technical assistance centers, and a couple that I want to highlight are: one, we have OSEP funded parent training and information centers, which are designed to provide information and training for parents and families and have specific resources to help this population. And we also have technical assistance centers that support a multi-tiered system of support MTSS framework, as well as the pyramid model framework for our early learners and universal design for learning. And I want to call out the pyramid model because I do remember the conversation that some of our panelists had about MTSS for the school age, but what's available for our younger students and our earliest learners. And that pyramid model is another opportunity to look at that framework. So that is wrapping up the first one. So the policies, practices, and TA that we've provided. Next up, let's talk about some grants that are available right now to support innovative and effective instruction. One is we're looking at and we're funding the recruitment and retention of multilingual scholars in special education and early intervention through personnel prep training grants and priorities. This means that education funds and special ed funds are going out to university programs that are actively recruiting diverse workforce people who can represent multilingual communities as well as individuals with disabilities. And we are looking at expanding and ways to expand those funds to be used for living expenses and other things beyond the educational program, so that people who have differing needs while they're gaining that training also can have some of those needs met, so that they're not always trying to work a full-time job and get education at the same time. Another grant opportunity is through the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed, or OESC, and they have 2 new TA centers that the application grant period is still open through June 24th. One is a center for English learners or multilingual students, and another one is for early school success. Those are open for applications as part of their comprehensive center's 5-year TA grant programs. So again, those are open through June 24th, and one of those is specific to the needs of English learners and multilingual students. And then another grant opportunity from OESC is our grants that support dually identified learners, such as the Teach Quality Partnership Program, the Comprehensive Literacy Development Program, and the Education Innovation and Research Programs. And yes, I will provide the links to all of these so that you'll have those direct links and can connect to those. The third area is one that I think is most impactful to me as an educator, but how it is that we can strengthen the special ed workforce. And again, this is something that I heard a panel talk about, like how do we make sure that the workforce providing services to this student group has the skills and qualifications that are needed for such unique needs. And so we have increased funding to support a strong pipeline of special ed teachers by 25 million or 28%. We're also, as I alluded to before, embracing diversity and recruiting special educators from diverse cultural backgrounds, including those who are multilingual and those who have disabilities. The funds that we're using are substantial, and in FY23, we had special ed teachers in training enrolled in over 150 department-funded special ed training programs across 48 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. So if this is something that you're interested in learning about, or you know somebody who might be interested in working in this field, working with students with individuals and students who are multilinguals, learners that have disabilities, working with individuals with disabilities of multiple ages, this is something you're going to want to check out. We'll drop in links to that as well for the group. And then the last thing that I want to talk about as part of strengthening the educator workforce is that we need to make sure that when we're talking about educator qualifications, that we ensure that everyone, all educators, not only our special educators, are equipped with the skills and practices necessary to meet the needs of students with unique needs, such as those who are multilingual and those with disabilities. We want to make sure that we have inclusive practices in which this student group is able to interact on an ongoing equitable basis in inclusive settings, such as the general ed classroom. And in order to do that well, we need to make sure that our general ed teachers and our school leaders and our leaders leading programs understand the skills and resources that are needed and are building those equitable programs. So to kind of wrap us up here, to further address the issues that were identified today, that were discussed together today, such as the overrepresentation of multilingual learners who have a disability, the disparate outcomes, such as higher dropout rates and lower graduation rates, we recognize the need for additional targeted policy-based solutions, while also accessing and amplifying those that are available. Hopefully today you learned about additional resources or research or evidence base that you were unaware of that you can now go out and use and amplify further. The good news is we know what works. We know the evidence base, we know the research, and we know the skills that our personnel need to support learning and post-school success for all students. In addition to continuing the actions that the Biden administration has already taken, we each need to commit to leading for equitable outcomes. You might be sitting there and thinking, what does she mean when she says lead for equitable outcomes? So let me provide some context. Learning doesn't just happen, although many teachers make it seem magical. Each of us, regardless of the formal role that we have in the educational system, whether we're an educator, whether we're an administrator, whether we're a program person, whether we're a family member or a parent or just a community member, we all have a role in the system. And we have to intentionally focus our time and efforts to support effective, evidence-based instruction for each and every student. We have to support the conditions for our schools, our personnel, our families, and our communities to remove and reduce the barriers to quality instruction and learning, such as antiquated policies that remove or restrict access for students to core instruction, while also adding opportunities for wraparound supports. We need to make sure that we're using trauma-informed, evidence-based practices to ensure our schools are safe, welcoming, and inclusive environments in which everyone is free to learn with the social, emotional, academic, and language development instruction that meets their unique and diverse needs. So with that, I'm asking you to lead for equitable outcomes. Consider how you're spending your time and what you focus on. Are those things that we're investing in supporting inclusive practices and learning-focused instruction? Do they include engaging with families for two-way communication and partnership that's designed to support and improve that learning? And if not, how will we change and adapt our practices to do what is still needed to best serve multilingual children with disabilities? What we choose to do today and tomorrow matters for children. I ask you to join me in doing what is needed for their improved outcomes. And with that, Carrie, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Gallo, for helping us understand the federal policy resources and strategies for these issues that we've discussed today. I really appreciate it. It's a perfect way to round out what we've heard today about the research, the practice, and the policies, bringing that all together to focus on better support for these students. This conversation will shape our agenda here at New America for the coming years, so we ask you all to please stay tuned, and you can subscribe to our early education newsletter through our website. Also, this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel and also through our New America website in the coming days. And we'll also add links to the many resources that the Assistant Secretary just mentioned. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of